People ask me when I make these presentations, why did you call this book The Cookie Doctor? And there was a good reason. When I was practicing for a couple of years, we used to get every month a little booklet coming across our desk, which was a pamphlet from one of the drug companies. And it was called The Medical Director's Notebook, and it used to have some very nice little stories in there. But one of the stories was about a doctor, country doctor, which I was, who was practicing medicine and had a very busy practice, and one of his families was at least 12 kids, and they were very poor, so he never charged them. But every Christmas, the mother of this family would bring him a big box of cookies. And one day he happened to be in an emergency at the hospital, and he saw one of his boys. And he said, Tommy, are you sick? He said, oh no, doctor. He said, Jimmy has appendicitis. And I brought him down here, and he said, I'll be operated on now. He said, well, why didn't you call me? Oh, he said, you're just a cookie doctor. We only go to you for colds and shots. But when we're really sick, we go to a real doctor. You know, the one that So I had a number of patients, as every doctor does, who you don't charge because they just don't have any money. And these were before the days of Medicare. My starting fee in general practice was $3. Some of you will remember that, but not everybody. Actually, in the 30s, it was $1. So I would not charge these people, and they would give me all kinds of things. Now, one Thanksgiving, I had 12 frozen turkeys, and I had cookies, and they knew that I liked shoe-fly pie. Well, I had, I think, 8 shoe-fly pies bouncing in the back of my car for quite a few weeks. So the girls, my 2 daughters, said, well, Dad, you know, you get all these cookies, you must be a cookie doctor. So when I wrote this book, that's why I used the name Cookie Doctor. Practicing medicine today is vastly different than what we did when I practiced. I quit practice in '78. I'll just give you a little bit of my background so that you can understand what I was facing as a country doctor. I never intended to actually practice clinical medicine. I wanted to be a researcher and a pathologist. And for reasons I go into it in the book, but I don't want to go into it now. During an internship, I ran into a political problem at Reading Hospital, and even though I was promised the residency, I didn't get it. In February of my internship, I found out that we had no place to go. I didn't have a residency. It's impossible to get a residency in that short period of time. So I had at least 1 year to mark time. I had purchased a farm in the Burnville area, and I thought, well, I could do general practice up here for a year. In the meantime, I would apply for residency. I was there 20 years. I don't know how it happened, but it just, my practice just grew, and you know, I got attached to the people and the families, and I kept telling my wife, well, I'll leave next year. But I never did. For the 20 years now, I finally realized with the modern insurance forms. You know, I had to hire 2 girls just to do insurance forms, which was ridiculous. You go into a doctor's office, they don't say to you, what's your problem? Say, let me see your insurance card. That's the first thing. And this was a new kind of medicine. I wanted to get out of it, and I had to find a doctor, and they did have a general practice department, which actually I started when I was practicing medicine. It was a fight, but we finally got it established. And I gave them the clinic. I said, you can use this to train general practitioners, and I trained one of my nurses, Gloria Kaufman, who was a wonderful graduate of Reading Hospital. She probably, you remember her. And Gloria became the first physician assistant in Pennsylvania. And I had her come to make rounds with me. And doctors were really upset because she didn't write on the nurses section of the chart. She wrote on the doctor's section. You can't do that. I said, she's doing it. She is representing me. And since I have the authority of the physician, she can write on it. So that's just a little bit of background. I didn't start out as a physician. I started out to be a priest. I spent 4 years in the seminary. I realized I wasn't going to make a good priest. So I always was interested in medicine. So I left. The war was just about over, and I got into the Marine Corps. They trained me as a sniper, and I ended up as a rifle coach, training other guys to shoot. And so I got out of the service, and back into college, spent 2 years in college, and my brother, who was an Army veteran, talked me into joining the Army Reserve. I was in the inactive Marine Reserve. And he said, you know, we get $5 a week, and we have good times, and get lots of beer, and meet guys. So I joined it, and my wife said, Peter, there's going to be another war. Don't do this. I said, honey, there's been 20 years before this is war. Like I said, so, October 1950, I found myself down at Camp Polk, Louisiana. As a tank commander, I didn't even know how to get into a tank. So I was there 2 years. And they were sending guys over to Korea all the time, but for some reason I was sent up to Fort Knox to learn how to fire a tank cannon, and I taught tank gunnery, but then I was very lucky to get a break. One day when I was in the dispensary, a little bulletin came around and said, opening for a laboratory technician in Houston, Texas, at Fort Sam Houston, over at Brooke General Hospital, which is one of the finest hospitals in the whole world. And I thought, wow, that would, if I could be a lab tech, I could pay my way to medical school working as a lab tech. So I signed up for it. And I sent it in, and got a call from the battalion commander 2 weeks later, and because he had to approve it. And he said, Sergeant, you're not getting out of here. I need you. So I'm disapproving of this. So he wrote on it, disapprove, K.K. Klaus, commanding officer. And I said, all right, sir. So I thought, well, I'm going to send him again. So I sent him in again, and then I got another call to see the commanding officer. Never a pleasant experience. And I walked in there and he had blood in his eyes. And he was so furious with me. He He said, you send this damn thing in one more time and I'm going to court-martial you. Do you understand that? I said, yes, sir, I do. And I was a little afraid then because he was serious. He was a West Pointer. So I went back to the dispensary and figured, well, it's a lost cause, you know, I'm doing my duty. And about an hour later, I heard this Jeep come up, screaming, wheels, and out comes the colonel with the major, and he is a hell of a mess. He's got a huge blister on his nose. His lips are all seared. His eyebrows are gone. What happened, he went down to the motor pool to check. He's a great fall guy, and he smoked cigarettes and always had a very fancy holder, and a little short warrant officer gave him a light, but he had filled his Zippo with high-octane gas. It was a veritable flamethrower. For 18 flamethrower. Sent him on fire. Well, he was in real pain. So as soon as he came in, I gave him a morphine syringe, which the soldiers carried. We had them in the dispensary. And in 10 minutes, he had no pain. He loved the whole world. Morphine does that to you. So I dressed his blister, drained it, because it was hanging down there. He looked like a proboscis monkey. And I put a cold compress on that, and a little lubricant, put a compress on his lips, and in about 20 minutes he's feeling pretty good. So I took the compress off, and he wanted a cigarette, and I gave him a cigarette. And we were talking, and he was under the influence of morphine then. And he said, well, Sergeant, you did a very good job. He said, and if I can do you a good turn, I will. Came the application. I said, well, would the Colonel reconsider? And he said, damn it, you got me over a barrel. Give me that damn paper. He signed it, approved, KK Club. And that's how I got into laboratory school. The Lord always looked after me. For some reason, I don't know why, but when things looked dark, I always had a blessing. But I want to tell you a story that has continually amazed me, and it's a story about Ernie, which is in the book. Ernie was a little Dutch guy. He was a wonderful boy. He had all kinds of things, hypertension and pre-diabetes, and occasionally he did an arrhythmia. But he came in one day and he said, I'm going to die from cancer. And I said, Ernie, how the hell do you possibly know that? Well, he said, I know. I'm not going to tell you. And I want to get a stomach x-ray every year. So he comes in, he figures day after New Year would send him down. So this went on for 3 years. And finally I said, Ernie, we must stop these x-rays. You're getting too much radiation. Now radiation is tumor. Just to give you an example, I'm going to use an old term because I learned it as Roentgen. It's a new term now. But that's a unit of radiation. You could take 5,000 Roentgens on your fingertip. You had a cancer. 4,000 Roentgens would kill 10 people. 400 Roentgens is all you need on your whole body to kill you. That's why atomic bombs are so terrible. And that's not a whole lot of radiation. So I was feeling sorry for him. He said, don't worry, this year you're going to find it. So I said, okay, but this is the last year on hell or high water we're going to do this. He came back, and he had gallstones and an obstructed bile duct. And I called him, I said, Ernie, we found something. You got gallstones in the bowel. Well, no, he said it's going to be something more than that. I said, well, it's what it shows on the x-ray. He said, it's going to be more. So I sent him down to Dr. Davis to have surgery. And Dr. Davis called me and said, "Oh, this is terrible." He said, "This fellow has carcinoma of the head of the pancreas. It's all over." And so I went down to see him. And I told him. He said, "See, I told you." I said, "Well, Ernie, you know this is a fatal disease." "I know that," he said. "I knew that 3 years ago." So, the surgeon was on the case, and I got another doctor on the case. We didn't have cancer specialists in those days, but there were some doctors who were interested in it, and I had this one fellow come. So I was going back and forth to the University of Pennsylvania doing a research project at the New Bolton Center, which is actually in a large veterinary school. It was my tumor was a bovine tumor from cattle. You know, I needed lots of tumor. And of course, these cows had huge tumors. So I would see him at nighttime. And so one night actually two nights, I missed him. I come home, I was so tired I just couldn't stop. So the third night I went in and I said, "Hi," and he said, "Where were you?" I said, "Well, Ernie, I'm down at the university and visiting town." "No," he said, "I don't think that's the case." He said, "I think you know I'm going to die and you just can't do anything. And you know, it stopped me in my tracks." And he said, "Doc, I have to tell you, I really need you now. I need you to help me to die." I just sat down by his bed and cried like a baby. I never realized that that's part of a doctor's job. People die. Nobody ever goes through it twice. Nobody knows how to die. You know, when you're dying, people abandon you. And I thought about this. My God, I don't know much about death. And he said to me, "You know, Ollie, his wife is going to need some help after I go. And Ernie always told me a joke when even the guy's dying of cancer. You look terrible." He was always yelling and used the word cachetic, which means you get very thin. But I have to say this, that it was a pleasure for me to see him, because I knew now I was doing something good for him. I was helping him to die. And so he told me this joke. He said there was that night, he knew I was upset, and he knew about me to be upset. And he said there was an old Dutchman who was dying, and the doctor sent him home, and like most Dutchmen, the first thing they'd ask was, "Well, what can I eat?" He said, "Jake, you can have anything you want." "Is that right?" "Yeah." I said, "Well, tell the wife." So he was home for about a week, and he said, "Mom, I would like to have a piece of that ham we have down in the basement curing." She said, "Pop, you can't have that ham." "Why?" He said, "I can have anything. Have you heard the doctor say that?" "Oh," she said, "That's right, but you can't have that ham." "Well, now why can't I have that ham?" "Well, I'm saving that for the funeral." This is a guy dying of cancer. I told you that. I really didn't know whether to laugh or not, but if I had to laugh, what you do, it was a funny thing. So a couple of days later, I went to see him. He was hanging by a thread, and He said, I am so happy to see you. He said, I had the funniest thing here. And he told me how he knew he was going to die. He heard voices. Now, you know in Berks County, you hear voices, you're up to Murdersville and short orders. But he heard these voices and said, Ernie, it's time to come home. And he kept hearing it. And over the years, the voices told him he was going to die of cancer, and he just knew this. Well, I didn't really believe that. But he probably has cerebral insufficiency, and he's popping a few arteries in his head. And, so he said, I have to tell you this. He said, I had the strangest experience. He said, I was just kind of falling asleep, and I heard this voice. Now, he said, I don't know if it said this for sure, but it sure did sound like it. It said, Ernest, rape the weeds and the cats in the turnip patch and eat them. Sir, it doesn't make a bit of sense. Well, I know, he said, but that's exactly what I said. Well, say that again. And he told me, and I wrote it down. He said, now, what does that mean? I said, it's just gibberish. I don't mean anything. So I was sitting there by his bed, and I was looking at this thing. Rape the weeds and the cats. Rape the weeds and the cats. Rape the weeds. And I go, oh my God. I said, Ernie, does it sound like this? Requiescat in pace in aeternum. What Jesus, I think it is. Say that again, Doc. I said, Requiescat in pace in aeternum. Why? He said, I don't know what that means. He said, is that some kind of foreign language or stuff? I said, it's ancient Greek. Well, what does it mean? It said, it means, may you rest in peace forever. I said, Ernie, it means have a good night's sleep. And then he was going to die in a day or so. And that had the most profound effect on me and anything in my lifetime. Because that had to be an angel that said that. The angel knew that I spoke Latin from the 4 years that I was in seminary. Latin is my second language. And so he said it in Latin because he also knew I didn't believe that he actually had an angelic vision. So I said, Ernie, you have been visited by an angel. And he kind of smiled and he said, what would an angel want with an old Dutchman? I said, I don't know that, but I can tell you this, you are a very special person to God. Well, it's not something that I would tell people. They're not going to believe it. I didn't really tell anybody, even my wife, until I wrote this in the book. She died before I wrote the book. I told her a few years before, and she said, I knew when you came home something happened because you were a very different person. I stopped at the airport. Remember your little parking lot by the airport near the restaurant? And I would stop there in times when I had problems with patients and trying to figure out what was wrong. And I look at the planes coming in, and I got out of the car, and I looked at the sky, and never did I realize how immense the sky was. It was, you know what a whiteout is in a snowstorm and you can't see? That's how many stars there were. I couldn't see it. It looked like a whiteout. And I just became aware of the majesty and power of God in at that instant, and it never returned, but it was a blessing that I had an opportunity to experience that. There are stranger things in life than we ever dreamed of, as Shakespeare said. Lots of things happened to me in medicine that I knew were beyond pale. Miracles. Some of them I really couldn't describe to you, but I often would pray for patients. One night a woman called me in absolute desperation, and she hung up. I had no idea who she was or where it was. The same thing happened to me when I first started practice. I was only in practice a couple of weeks, and a woman called me and said, "Why, Doc, this is so-and-so, I'm going to throw my kids in the well." Now, what the hell do you say to a person like that? They don't teach you something like that in medical school. So I just said, "Don't do anything till I get there." "I won't," she said, and hung up. Who was she? Where was she? No. Now, fortunately, we had those phones in the Burnville that had crank, and an operator would say, "Hello." And I said, "Operator, who was that?" She said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Look, for God's sake, this is a life or death matter. Tell me who that woman was and where she lives." And she brought so-and-so, she lived. I said, "Okay, bingo." Jumped in the car, zoom, got to the farm. Fortunately, it was only about half a mile away. Pulled in the driveway, and here was this woman with 3 little kids standing by the well with the top off. So immediately I put myself between the well and these women. All I could think of was 1 or 2 kids down in a 60-foot well. Some of these wells are that deep, most of them are 15 to 20. And drowning. And I didn't have a rope and a ladder or anything. I put myself in front of those little kids and I said, "I think we should put the children in the car." And we did. Well, it's the first story in the book. And anyhow, I got her in the hospital, and I had to get her husband's permission. Finally located him, and I told him, "Wife's going to be in the hospital for a couple of days." You know what he said to me? "Well, who's going to get my eats?" You ever have the urge to kill and to maim? Couldn't believe the callousness and the stupidity and the lack of feeling from that man. I could see no wonder this woman had a postpartum psychosis. I said, "Your wife is sick." "Well, why up to you?" So I got the mother-in-law to take care of him. That guy is impossible. Anyhow, she did very well, and she's actually still alive, and the children are all alive. God inspires us sometimes when we get like that. There are times that a person will come into you and have something, and you wouldn't have the foggiest what it was. But you knew it was something serious. That there was an instinct you developed in medicine. So I had a woman come in, she said, "My hands are stiff." She was a very nice woman. And sure enough, they were kind of stiff. And I was seeing at that time probably 90 people a day. Now, what can you do with 90 people? You do triage. couldn't spend much time with her, but I said, let me think about this, Mary, and I'll do it. So I went home, and I said, Lord, really help me, give me a clue. And I was lying in bed, and all of a sudden, I said, scleroderma. And my wife jumped up and said, what's wrong, what's wrong? I found the diagnosis for her. That's what she has. And I couldn't wait till morning to get over there and talk to her. It started on, well, it was fatal, couldn't do much. She had systemic typhus scleroderma, and as I was talking to her, she had a terrible headache out, and it's fierce. And she said, my vision's a little blurred. I said, okay. I said, Mary, we're going to put you in the hospital. Within a minute, she was totally blind. The blood vessels in her palm. She was unconscious. She died 2 days later. You see those kinds of things in medicine, and you feel very uncomfortable about it because you can't do it. A fellow came in one day, and it's in the evening after the milking, and he said, I'm just so tired, Doc, I don't know, I can hardly get through the day. And so I did the blood count on him. His hemoglobin was like 8.5. It should be 15. It's like a 6-cylinder car running on 3 cylinders. I put him in the hospital right away. And I made a fuss because he had milking to do and he had to ride. I said, no, we'll arrange for that. You got to go to the hospital today. Went in the hospital. A week later, he was dead. He had, we did an autopsy on him. He had biliary melanoma. Melanomas are little pigmented things that spread like wildfire. And this went all through his body. He must have had that for months, and he was working. And there's actually no treatment. We still don't have any really good treatment against some. So those are kind of things that you think about in medicine. So I wanted to share that with people because medicine had drifted a long way, but the one thing that we have, and it has not changed, is that God exists. God is responsible for every breath we take. The more you study science, the more you realize there has to be a God. A lot of scientists don't believe in God because they're stuck on themselves. They don't want anybody smarter than them. Like they say, well, light started from just like a rock. Well, I said, I'll believe that when I can say to a rock, good morning, and it'll answer back, but I'm not going to believe it for them. But they are so strong in our society. 90% of all college professors and university professors are liberals, and they believe this. You can't mention God anymore. You're going to offend somebody. Hell with it. I believe in God, and I want you to know that. I believe that we could not exist without God, and that we don't really use God the way we should. I look upon God as our Father. And as a father, you're going to get the best. You're going to get love. And God is love. You get right down to it. And I have a little thing in the last portion of my book, I tell a story about my grandfather. I was a very little guy when he passed away. I was about 2 and a half. But when I was 2, I used to wobble over a little fat guy. And when he had breakfast, I lived in the house next to him. And he'd have breakfast, and he was very Italian, born in Italy. And he'd say to me, in Italian, a little fat guy, he would call me, Cigolo, vieni qua, facciamo due passi. And I understood that. It meant, hey, little fat guy, let's you and I go to the wall. And he put his finger out, and I'd reach up and grab his finger. And we would go looking through the gardens, and he would be speaking Italian all the time, and I didn't understand a word of it most of the time. Just a few words that I gathered. And I felt so safe there. I felt that nothing in the world could happen that my grandfather couldn't handle. It gave me a lot of strength holding on to that work-worn finger. But that's how I look at God. That you don't really take the hand of God, just take a finger. When you have a tough time, you go to your dad and say, boy, I have this and have that. And they would comfort you or say, well, we can do this, we can do that. God can do it. I mean, there's nothing that he can't do. So that's all you have to do is say, Lord, give me some help. I need it. And you'll get it. And it's a resource which is, you can't put a price on it, you can't measure it. It's there. And it's very simple.
I was just wondering, before you wrap up, could you tell the story of your first delivery?
Oh, yes. In medical school, when you're learning to do deliveries, you learn from a manual. But then comes a time when you get a real woman. And I had my obstetrics, part of it, at Philadelphia General Hospital, which is gone now. And they were mostly charity patients, but the Philadelphia General Hospital also treated 2 other kinds of people. Policemen and their family, and firemen and their family, in the city hospital. So I was, they had, I think, 12 or 16 delivery rooms, and they always had an intern and a resident. Well, there was like a resident every 2 or 3 interns. But that night we were frightfully busy, and I was called to see this woman, and I said, well, where's the intern? She said, well, we don't have an intern. You have to deliver the baby. I had never delivered a baby. I had seen it on movies. I did it with a mannequin, but I had watched doctors deliver, but I never delivered one. So immediately I got nervous. Well, it was a lady who was what we call a gravida 12, para 11. This was her 12th pregnancy. So I got my little towel, had my glasses on, scrub suit and mask, and I was sweating like you wouldn't believe. In fact, it was like driving a car with a rainstorm. And I couldn't wipe, and so she looked at me and she said, Sonny, don't you be nervous. It didn't inspire me because I was supposed to be a doctor. She said, I'm going to blow this baby right into your hand. So I'm standing there. Now when the baby's born, as the head comes out, it has to go up like this, and that's called extension. And then it turns to get the shoulder lined up so the shoulder can come out. So all this takes time, most of it. So you watch for that, and you watch for that. So I'm standing there watching for this to happen, and she said, "Come, shot, come!" And I damn near missed it. I just tripped it because it would have gone in the bucket. and just, I saw the foot, coming out of the vagina, whack! I grabbed it and held on to it. And I harbored beating tears, and I couldn't see anything. And she said, "Now, if you put that baby on the table there," and of course I did. And she said, "There's two things there that look like scissors, but they ain't. They called hemostats. You put one here, and a cord, and one there, and you cut in between." I did that. She said, "No, she said, you don't take that baby. You put that in the eye. And make sure you wash them out or they get really pussy." The silver nitrate, and you did that mechanically. So I put the silver nitrate in, my hand was coming, washed it out, and there it was. That was my first delivery. I felt 10 feet tall. But, yes.
I was going to say, maybe given the audience, you might want to take a minute or two and talk about your USO girl. About your USO girl and the difference between going into the seminary and going into medicine, and how you reconcile that and how you look at that as from life from where you sit right now.
Well, I had the most wonderful wife in the world, beautiful beyond belief, very shy. Men are stupid. They don't appreciate their wives till they're gone. Every woman that raises a family, I'm sure there's a special place in heaven for her. When my wife died, then I had to do things like cooking, which I didn't know duty about, housekeeping, which I knew less about. Endless things, shopping. It's a terrible thing to do shopping. Getting the things in, knowing what to buy, and putting it in, and cooking it, and all of it. So she said to me when she was dying, she said, "Peter, I want you to get married." And I said, "Why in the world do I want to get married?" She said, "You are a hopeless case." "You don't even know where the cleaner works." Which is true, I had no idea. I said, "Well, who is going to marry an 85-year-old guy?" And she said, "Well, there's lots of women that will marry." Anyhow, I said, "Well, if I can find one half as good as you, I'd think about it." But that's a pretty hard thing. When I was in the seminary, you don't really think about women because you're going to have a life of celibacy, and it's a different kind of thing, different kind of work. But I met my wife when I was in the Marine Corps. But the horror was that when I left the seminary, I didn't leave definitively. I got a 2-year leave of absence. And then I met my wife. And we became engaged. And as we got, and I got another year extension on the seminary. And as we got closer to the wedding, I actually went into a state of panic. Because once I was married, I could never be free. It's irreversible. So I told her that she saw something that was wrong with me, and I said, I think I just have to go back to seminary. The reason I felt that was when I left seminary for the last time, I was going through the gate, and this biblical phrase popped into my head. No man, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is worthy of the kingdom of God. And I said, I'm turning my back on God if I get married. I left because the life of a priest is terribly hard, and I just couldn't do that. There are lots of other things, but that's one of the main things. I just wasn't strong enough to be a priest. Anyhow, that phrase popped up, and I was in college, and she was working. We're going to get married in June, and this was April. And she said, well, Peter, if you don't feel good about it, we shouldn't get married. So we broke engagement. And I couldn't stop thinking about it, though, but I called the seminary and told them I was coming back. But I knew I wasn't really. And my brother and I were the one that got me involved in the Korean War. We were working on a highway, state highway. We were leveling rock. Highway 73. And we come there at 7. The guys would have breakfast. We didn't start work till 9:30. At 10:30, we'd go on break. Till 12, then we went to lunch from 12 to 1. We'd come back, we'd work about a half an hour, and we'd go on break again. And the break lasted 3 hours. And I couldn't quite figure this out. I realized that we were making $1 an hour. Not a hell of a lot of money. But on Saturday we made $1.50, and Sunday we made $2. So that what the foreman was doing was delaying the work so he could get overtime. So we were there about 3 or 4 days, and I got tired of this. And my brother Mark got tired. He said, let's go do some work. They've been sitting here for 3 hours. So we went out the road, we started level rock. Foreman came, what are you guys doing? My brother said, well, we're working. You're supposed to be on break. We've been on break 3 hours. All right, a couple wise guys. You're fired. So you can't fire us. We quit. That was the end. We're coming home, and he said, you look like you're preoccupied. I said, well, I'm thinking about Joanne and wondering about getting married. He said, Pete, look, I never gone back to seminary. Why the hell was this married that girl? I'm done with it. And by golly, you know, I came home and I told my mother, and she said, send her a telegram, which we did in those days. It was 1949. So I sent her a telegram, and I got a telegram back, and she said, come down, she was in Florida, come down and we shall discuss the terms of surrender. So I jumped on my motorcycle, kicked off, and drove down Florida. Got down there, it looked like a boiled lobster. We didn't have to wear helmets then. Still, my nose was like a ball of fire. But anyhow, we got married, and let's just tell you about a little bit about the wedding. I had a tuxedo, which I bought for the junior prom in college. I was a freshman. So I sent that over to get printing press. And Saturday morning, we were getting married. I came over to get the tuxedo, brought it back, and put the pants on. They were 54 waist and 28 leg. I'm 6'1". not a 32 waist then. So I went over to the guy and said, look, it's the wrong trouser. He said, I can't help it. It's too late. We close at 12. And he sent it to the cleaner. Anyhow, I came home and said, Mom, you can't. She said, I'll take care of it. So she folded it over and pinned them. And the crotch was down to my knee. So I couldn't walk. And coat to the trousers. And so I had to take little scissor steps. So I'm standing there hoping the pants don't fall off. Fortunately, we weren't married in the church because my wife was a Baptist at the time, and she had been taking instructions. So if you were Catholic married and non-Catholic, you had to get married in the rectory. So we were in the rectory, we just a very small group of people there. And so I was standing there, she looked absolutely gorgeous. And all I could think of was, don't fall down, let my pants fall. It did. Anyhow, as soon as I got home, of course, I took them off and put a pair of slacks on. But it wasn't an auspicious beginning for a wedding, and we only had a one-night honeymoon, so I only had $13, and that was all the money I had in the world. And my dad was still angry with me for leaving seminary. He didn't like that at all. But he gave me his car. It was on the honeymoon. So I think about it. We didn't have a big reception. Mommy cooked, my mother cooked a meal for us. I had a friend had one ring for a wedding. He came in from Boston, later became a lawyer and was a famous judge. He was the only outsider we had at the wedding. But the fascinating thing about that is my marriage lasted 61 years. Both of my brothers had huge weddings, thousands of dollars. They both collapsed. They left. It isn't the big ceremony that I found that counts. It's kind of lovely to have for each other. But what I learned on this, which I can tell you, and most of you who have had happy marriages know this. The problem one of the problems for marriages today is that it's all about them. Me, it's about me, my being happy. It's not about your partner. So if you can say, I married this girl or this guy, and I want them to be really happy, my whole life is for them to be happy. So a simple thing like going to a movie, you'd say, what would you like to see? Well, what would you like? No, I got some movies. I hated music. And my wife is a movie buff, and she went to see Gigi. And I thought, oh, see another musical. Well, upset her, whether to make her happy. We went to see Gigi. It turned out to be one of my favorite movies. So I learned those things. But if you live for the happiness of your spouse, you can't help but have a good marriage because it all comes back to you. So that's my experience. And thank you for being here and listening to this. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.